Good afternoon, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Comprehensive History Instruction Webinar Series. I am Dr. Delsa Chapman. I serve as the Deputy Superintendent for the Division of Educator, Student, and School Supports. Today, we are fortunate to have a very exceptional presenter with us, Dr. Pamela Brandwein of the University of Michigan's Department of Political Science, to discuss several topics from Civil War amendments up to the Civil Rights Movement. This is the fourth topic in a series that the department is offering associated with a comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history. As our visionary leader, Dr. Michael F. Rice, shared with us during the first of this series, as searing as our history is, it must be taught. We are appreciative that Dr. Rice is intentional in leading the way in making sure that the breadth and depth of our comprehensive history is equitable and that all students and educators across this great state of Michigan have access thereof. It is important to note that within this series, there will be topics that align with court decisions and legislative acts, very comprehensive as it should be. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to Dr. Brandwein for sharing her expertise and assisting in the growth of knowledge and understanding among our educators, who will then share with our students. I'd also like to thank the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series team for its continued efforts in organized spaces for us as educators and leaders within education to meet and to learn. Finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for joining us, for your intentional effort in making sure that you continue to grow in this area of knowledge that all of us should avail ourselves to. Thank you today for your intentionality, for your interest, and for your courage. And now to Scott Koenig. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chapman. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Scott Koenig, and I am a social studies consultant with the Michigan Department of Education. We're thrilled to have you all in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I introduce today's presenter, I want to share a few housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature, and questions will be addressed toward the end of this event if time permits. If we run out of time, we will follow up with Q&A through email. We will provide a link to access a resource folder. This folder contains our presenter's outline and supporting resources for you to explore throughout today's presentation. Also, if you would like a sketch for attending today, please be sure to sign in on the sketches link that will be provided in the chat during today's presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the View button at the top right of the Zoom window. Towards the end of today's presentation, a linked survey will be presented to you at the close of this webinar. Please provide us with your feedback. Closed captioning and an American Sign Language interpreter have been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Candace Barrier. Today, we welcome back Dr. Pamela Brandwein, a professor of political science at the University of Michigan. Last week, Professor Brandwein spoke on the slavery conflict, and today she will speak on Reconstruction. She is a specialist in the law and politics of Reconstruction, and her research interests focus on American constitutional development, race politics and civil rights, and American political development. To save time for her presentation, we won't repeat the full introduction from last week, except to note that she's written 2 books on the Supreme Court and Reconstruction and won numerous awards for her teaching. Thank you for being with us once again, Dr. Brandwein.
Thank you, Scott. It is really an honor and a privilege to be back with everybody. So I'm just going to dive right in. Okay, so there is a familiar saying that history is written by the winners. Regarding the Civil War and Reconstruction, history was originally written by the losing side. And that history lasted for well over half a century. Now, the way it's often framed is that the South lost the war but won the peace. But the key thing here is that that couldn't have happened without Northern agreement. And that Northern acceptance, that Northern agreement started in about the 1890s. And this is the beginning of the Jim Crow period, which is going to be my subject next week. And so this Southern story is called Lost Cause mythology. And I want to start today by just briefly outlining some elements of Lost Cause mythology, because some of these elements may sound familiar to you. Historians overthrew this story in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, but the history that got written in the 60s, 70s, and 80s really hasn't filtered out completely. That lost cause story is very sticky institutionally. So I'm going to outline that, and then I'm going to turn to Reconstruction. And there are going to be two lines of division in the Reconstruction Congresses that I am going to focus my remarks on. And the Reconstruction Congresses passed the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and some very important enforcement legislation. So these two lines of conflict, these two lines of division in the Congresses. The first one was between Republicans who voted for Reconstruction legislation and the Northern Democrats who voted against it. Now, something to make clear immediately is that the Southern Democrats were not in Congress at this point. They walked out with secession, so they are not there. Those Northern Democrats are war Democrats. They were for the Union. Okay, so this is the first line of division. The second line of division pertained to the centrists and the more radical Republicans. So it's an intramural disagreement between within the Republican Party. The centrists have the balance of power. Now, I'm going to talk about what they shared and what divided them, but all of these conflicts had racialized dimensions. And by that, I mean that there were racial meanings and racial ideologies that were built into all of these positions. Now, again, as last time, the way to teach this is to teach the conflicts between the Republicans and the Northern Democrats, the conflicts between Republicans and the Southern Democrats, what's going on in the South. And these conflicts evolve, and they evolve very rapidly. And so the sequence that I'm gonna sort of flesh out today is gonna be quite a rapid one. Now, there's an overarching framework for understanding and for teaching Reconstruction, and it connects to my presentation from last time. And if you remember, we have a union coalition, and the anti-slavery coalition is a part of that. And that anti-slavery coalition was about non-extension, the non-extension of slavery. But they supported non-extension for a whole lot of different reasons with very variable racial ideologies. In 1860, there was a split in the Democratic Party when the Southern Democrats wanted slave law in the territories, and the Northern Democrats rejected that. And then when the South seceded, you have a whole lot of what were called war Democrats that rejected secession. Now, these war Democrats are people like Andrew Johnson, who became president when Lincoln was assassinated. And Andrew Johnson believed in white man's government. He supported this idea that only white men were fit to rule the South, but he's a unionist. He's a unionist, and he rejects the planter aristocracy. And so he's part of the union effort. Now, the key thing to understand in terms of this framework is that all of these members of the union coalition are going to say that slavery is a problem. You ask any of them, is slavery a problem? They're all going to say yes, but they're going to give very, very different reasons about what in slavery was the problem. And this disagreement over the problem with slavery is going to transform. After Grant beats Lee, that dispute is going to transform into a dispute over what it meant to destroy slavery. And so this is going to be an argument over the meaning of freedom. Now, one of the takeaways from last time is that you could be anti-slavery and anti-Black. One of the takeaways from today is that you can support the Union and vote against every single piece of Reconstruction legislation. Okay, lost cause mythology. This was a Southern story about the war and Reconstruction embraced by the North starting in about the 1890s. Number of key elements. First, the Confederacy fought for states' rights. Noble cause, a divine principle. This removed slavery as a cause of the war. Now, this is easily disproven, and I gave you sources last time to show this. Everything the South said in 1860 and 1861 was, we're fighting for slavery. You have the Mississippi Declaration of Secession, you had the Cornerstone speech. So that's this first element, this states' rights story, prevalent, still sticking around. Second element is that Reconstruction was a mistake. The idea that is presented in lost cause mythology is that the South was ready to do justice to the former slaves, that President Andrew Johnson was fair-minded, and it was the radical Republicans. And Reconstruction is presented as a radical effort, even though in fact centrists were in charge. These radical Republicans are presented as vengeful, as vindictive, as full of hate, as concerned only about power. And President Grant is presented as an incompetent who is over his head. Next element is an image of Blacks as incapable of freedom. There's an old image of slaves as contented, the image of the quote, faithful slave. And there's a newer image of Black men in particular as beasts. And this Black as beast trope, that beast stereotype, is going to become very, very important during the Jim Crow era. Next is a picture of Reconstruction legislation as undue centralization and the government as oppressive. Big element in lost cause mythology. And then finally, there's an image of the Klan as the heroes of this history, that they save the South, that they redeem the South, they throw off this oppressive rule and establish home rule in the South, which is redemption. Okay, so that's just this sketch, and I wanted to identify it because I think some elements of it might be familiar to you. Now, to turn to Reconstruction, scholars today understand Reconstruction as America's second revolution, that it's a refounding, a second founding. Lincoln's new birth of freedom language gets quoted frequently. And as a general matter, what's happening is that the foundations of public life were thrown open. National identity is being debated. What it means to belong to America, equal citizenship, is on the table for the first time. And this is really a debate, a conversation about the meaning of freedom, which this country is having for the first time. Now, Reconstruction refers to a bundle of related problems. The first one is the status of the seceded states. They left. There's a question about, well, what are the terms on which they shall return? That they will be readmitted, I should say, to the Union. Second, the meaning of equality under law. All Republicans were committed to this principle, but they had different meanings. They had narrower and broader meanings about what equality under law required. Next, federalism. That's a technical term, it's a bit sterile. Federalism refers to the distribution of power between the federal government, the national government, and the states. And then last, there are questions about the rights of national citizenship. What did it mean to be a citizen of the United States? So those four issues are intertwined. I'm going to be hitting on all of them over the next hour. And again, this is going to be a story of rapid flux. Now, the place to begin that story of rapid flux is actually going back to 1860. Now, if you remember from last time, there was the general consensus in the antebellum era that Southern slavery was constitutional. Free soil was about extension, but the general consensus was that Southern slavery was constitutional. Now, there was an axiom at the time, which was that the non-extension of slavery would eventually kill Southern slavery. And the logic here is that, well, once you have the free states accumulating, the slave interest loses control of Congress. They lose the Senate, they lose the House, and politically, they lose their pull. And then on top of that, the idea is that they're going to exhaust the soil if they're contained. If slavery can't expand, that soil is going to get exhausted, and slave crops, their profitability is going to go down. And so economically, it's going to fade away. And so this was believed even by the David Wilmots of the world. If you remember David Wilmot, a free soil Democrat who talked about the Western territories for white labor. Well, even he understood that the containment of slavery would eventually kill Southern slavery. Now, at the same time, there's a tension regarding the presence of free Black people for almost the entire white population in the North. And for the vast majority of them, they did not see the United States as a biracial country. They did not entertain the possibility of political inclusion. And Lincoln in 1858, and if you remember this from last time, yes to inclusion in the Declaration of Independence, yes to property rights for Blacks, but no vote, no political inclusion, and no social equality. And so this is where Republicans, not even the Democrats who explicitly were talking about white man's government, this is where they were in 1860. Now, when the South fired on Fort Sumter, the goal was to put down rebellion, and the goal was to preserve the Union. But remember, we get these war Democrats who come in with a much narrower critique of what's wrong with slavery. With the Civil War, Union goals shift. And that's because of the just profound destruction that came with the Civil War. Tremendous loss, tremendous destruction. Right now, the numbers are that 750,000 people died. This was a combination of in North and the South. That was about 2.5% of the population. And if you extrapolate that to today, that's 8 million people. And so think about the scale of that loss. And it's that scale of loss that made everybody in the Union coalition say, slavery caused this. We can never let this happen again. We must destroy slavery. And so in addition to that, another thing that's important about the war is that 180,000 free Blacks served in the Union Army, and about 40,000 died. And Black soldiering made a very large impression on the white mind. And many slaves, in addition to that, escaped to Union lines. They essentially freed themselves. And Congress came in to support this. In 1861, Congress barred the Union Army from returning these people to the South as fugitives. Now, so they gained free legal status. But the thing to note here is that Congress does this under what's called their war power. This was not done as a regular exercise of legislation. And the Emancipation Proclamation was also done as a presidential war power. And so it was tied legally to the status of slaveholders as committing treason. Now, it wasn't until the 13th Amendment in 1865 that you start to see a change in the constitutional order. And the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. Now, that language was taken from the Northwest Ordinance, and it was seen at the time as the legitimate expression of how you abolish slavery. So they borrowed that language from the Northwest Ordinance. Now, to get a sense of this first line of conflict between the Republicans and the Northern Democrats, the vote in the House for the 13th Amendment was 119 to 56. Those 56 votes were Northern Democrats. And there were 14 Democrats that said yes to the 13th Amendment. Most of them were lame ducks. So Northern Democrats in the beginning, most of them refused to even accept emancipation. And they're still in that antebellum mindset where Congress does not have the power to abolish slavery in the Southern states. Now, the thing to understand about Northern Democrats is that they come to accept formal emancipation as the price of secession. Now, remember, these war Democrats didn't like the planter aristocracy, but they did vote against the 13th Amendment, most of them, but they do come to say, well, there's a price for you starting the war, and that's that you have to give up your slaves. Now, this fight, this racialized fight between Republicans and Northern Democrats really explodes with what are called the Black Codes in 1865. This was the Southern response to the 13th Amendment. It was clear when the 13th Amendment got through that the Southern states were going to give the narrowest possible definition of freedom, the narrowest possible definition of the destruction of slavery. And the Black Codes that they passed in the wake of the 13th Amendment is their resistance. And you have in your resources excerpts from Mississippi and South Carolina, their Black Codes. And what you see is that there's a right to self-ownership, formal emancipation. There's also some formal rights to own property, but Black people are given one set of rules and white people are given a separate set of rules. And so the Black Codes have what are called facial classifications. White people, one set of rules, Black people, a different set of rules. And the rules that apply to Black people, for example, they had no right to testify in court against white people. And think about the implications of this. Mississippi barred political gatherings for Black people. They made, quote, insulting gestures for Black people a crime. Stealing a horse by a Black person was given a penalty of death. For a white person, you were fined. In Louisiana had passed laws where Black people had to have evidence of their employment. In South Carolina, Black people had to pay a fee if they were employed as something other than a servant or a farmer. Florida made it a crime for a Black person to leave their job. And in all of these Black Codes, there were what were called apprenticeship laws. And these were not really apprenticeship laws. What they allowed former slave owners to do was to conscript Black children to work for no pay, and without the consent of their parents. People who were enslaved had no control over their families during slave times, and this was a continuation of that. Now, Republicans, all of them, centrist and radical alike, viewed the Black Codes as a violation of free labor principles, and they had no doubt about that. And they said that these Black Codes were in violation of the 13th Amendment. And they passed what was called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And this was the nation's first civil rights law. And the core principled consensus among all Republicans was that they said the Declaration of Independence is their guiding text, and that equal natural rights, property, contract, suing, testifying, being subject to the same criminal penalties, that those equal rights were necessary for freedom. And these rights were necessary for the destruction of slavery. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1866 actually lists those rights. Property, contract, suing, testifying, same criminal penalties. We see these rights as very narrow today, but this is what was seen as necessary for freedom at the time, and this was clearly an equality measure. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 also defined national citizenship for the first time, and this was to overturn the Dred Scott decision that said that Black people couldn't be citizens. It also had a provision for the removal of cases to federal courts, and that was because state courts could not be trusted to dispense equal justice. Now, one of the things I've provided are a speech and excerpt by a senator. His name is Lyman Trumbull, Lyman, L-Y-M-A-N, Trumbull. He was the manager of the Civil Rights Act in the Senate. And I want to use his speech in that excerpt to draw out these two lines of division, because basically it's impossible to talk about Reconstruction in an hour. So I'm picking some specific things to highlight main lines of conflict. And so Lyman Trumbull is a centrist. He's a centrist Republican. And this first line of conflict is with the Northern Democrats. Okay, so the Northern Democrats said no to the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They thought the Black Codes were just fine, that the Black Codes were the definition of emancipation. They said that Congress had no power to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866. They said that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery and that was the whole of it. And that's the kind of language they used. That was the whole of it. The whole of abolishing slavery is formal self-ownership and property rights. And so we see in their position a very narrow definition of slavery's destruction. Trumbull responds. He says, yes, Congress has the power under the 13th Amendment. There's an enforcement clause in the 13th Amendment that gives Congress power to enforce it. And he says, if Congress can't pass the Act of 1866, then the 13th Amendment is, quote, a cheat and a delusion. And so we get from Trumbull this centrist Republican definition of slavery's destruction in 1866. They're going to move, they're going to get more expansive in their definition of slavery's destruction, but not yet, not in 1866. Now, the other thing Northern Democrats said is that the Act of 1866 destroys states. They said this is centralization, it is a destruction of states. And Trumbull's response was, no, it's not a destruction of states. And he said, this legislation doesn't kick in, it doesn't give the federal government any power unless the states don't do their duty. So he says, so long as the states do not deny rights, the national government has no more power in the areas of traditional state jurisdiction than it had before the war. He said the rights of the freedmen are to be protected by the states if they do their duty, but by the federal government if they will not. So two things here. This is a change in federalism. This is a change in the distribution of power between the federal national government and the states, because before the Civil War, if the states did not do their duty, there was nothing the federal government could do. With the Act of 1866, there's now federal corrective power. But Trumbull says this in no way is a destruction of states because they're supposed to do their jobs. And it's not centralization because, again, if they do their jobs, none of this national authority kicks in. But it is very important to understand this alteration in federalism, which is federal corrective power. Okay, so that's the distinction between the Republicans and the Northern Democrats. Trumbull is also responding to the radical Republicans in these materials that you have. And this is that second line of division. Now, the more radical Republicans had a broader definition of the meaning of freedom. And they argued that voting rights were included in the definition of freedom. And at the time, voting rights were called political rights. Now, this is a distinction that we don't use today, but before the Civil War, there was a common distinction between what were called civil rights and political rights. And voting was not seen as a natural right. It was a political right granted by the political community. White men without property did not get the vote until the Jackson era. And so the vote to white men without property came as a political right. And so radicals are saying freedom, emancipation is both civil rights and political rights. Trumbull responds to this and he says, some want political rights included in the Act of 1866. Some want voting rights included in the Civil Rights Bill. And he says, political rights are not necessary for freedom. And here he's talking to the radicals. And he also points to white women. White women were seen as, before the Civil War, they're seen as free. They have citizenship, but they don't have the vote. And so Trumbull is referring to women as an example of how you can be free without having the vote. So he's saying this bill goes no further than to protect civil rights. So this civil rights category has to be understood in the narrow term, in its narrow definition that it had at this point in time. It is not the big expansive category that we have today. Okay, so radical Republicans had a broader definition of freedom. Frederick Douglass is in this camp. You have a speech that he gave to the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1863, where he says, our work is not done. The destruction of slavery is not finished until Black men have the vote. Centrists come to accept this later on, but like I said, not yet. Now, President Andrew Johnson vetoes. Johnson is president now. Lincoln has been assassinated. Johnson is president. Johnson vetoes this bill. As I was alluding to earlier, Andrew Johnson was a Northern Democrat. He's a unionist. He's with the Union. He was Lincoln's running mate in 1864. Johnson is associated with the common white man, very sympathetic to poor whites, hated the planter aristocracy, but he supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. He supported Breckinridge for president in 1860, and Breckinridge was the Southern candidate. So you have a sense of Andrew Johnson. Johnson supported the Black Codes. He thought the Black Codes were the definition of freedom. Now, in his veto message, which you have, he said, you have excerpts of that veto message. He said that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 discriminated against white people. He said it operates against the white race. Now, it's an equality measure. It's written into it, clearly, it's an equality measure. He says white men alone must manage the South. The reason he thinks this discriminates against white people is because he believes in white popular sovereignty, that white majorities get to make the rules. The only rule they can't make now is formal slave law. But other than that, and the right to property, very narrowly defined, white majorities can do things like pass the Black Codes. Johnson said that the Act of 1866 encourages dependency among Blacks, that only, quote, self-help should be encouraged, that this was a stride toward centralization. Now, Congress overrides the veto. So after America's first civil rights law, we had the first veto of a civil rights law. Then we had the first override of a veto. And what this generated for Republicans is this anxiety about repeal. They started to worry that the Act of 1866 could be repealed. There were some other reasons they were worried about the Act of 1866, but the main one was that they realized if Northern Democrats get control of Congress, they're going to repeal this act. And so they write a new constitutional amendment. And the new constitutional amendment they write is the 14th Amendment, which was passed in Congress in 1866. And the idea is that, okay, now the 14th Amendment will cement the war's objectives. Now, the 14th Amendment is written in much broader terms than the Act of 1866. It doesn't list specific rights. You have Section 1, where you have birthright citizenship now constitutionalized. In Section 1, you have language that says no state shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. In the antebellum era, states barred the entry of free Blacks. South Carolina put free Black sailors in jail when they landed at Charleston. Southern states shut down abolitionist speech. And Republicans believed that states should not be allowed to do this, and that there was something called national citizenship, and that national citizenship rights should apply everywhere. And so the 14th Amendment, in part, is meant to protect that. Section 1 also had the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. No state shall deny the equal protection of the law to any person, shall deny due process to any person. And these two clauses have been at the center of rights expansions in the 20th century and disputes over rights expansions in the 20th century. And there was also Section 5, which gave Congress power to enforce this legislation. Now, again, the 14th Amendment does not extend to the vote as it was understood at the time. Centrists are still not there. You have in your materials a file on the 14th Amendment, and it has some links to contemporary scholarly debates over these clauses. And I included them really for you. I think for some younger students, they're too complicated, but it can provide just a general sense of ongoing scholarly dispute over these elements of the 14th Amendment. But in terms of what's going on, back to Reconstruction, 10 Southern states rejected the 14th Amendment. They refused to pass it. And you need 3/4 of the states to ratify before you get the amendment passed. And when those Southern states rejected the 14th Amendment, this emboldened Andrew Johnson. And what he did is that he made this upcoming election, the 1866 upcoming election, he made it a referendum on the 14th Amendment, because he thought he was in good shape. And basically he's campaigning saying, it's me and my veto and the Black codes versus the Republicans and their Act of 1866 and their 14th Amendment. And to Johnson's great surprise, the election of 1866 returned a landslide for Republicans. And this is very important because it indicates that the white Northern population had moved. They moved substantially from where they were just 6 years ago in 1860. And they tie the war's objectives to the physical security of Blacks in the South and to the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And just as an indication of this landslide, the House goes 172 to 46 for Republicans. The Senate goes 57 to 9. Those are incredible majorities. Now, okay, to speed things up, because I'm rapidly falling behind, they pass immediately a piece of legislation called the Reconstruction Act of 1867. A couple of highlights. First, they impose military rule in the South, but it's temporary. In the border states, soldiers are gone by 1870. Only 3 states are left with soldiers by 1876. The key thing about this act is that it laid out steps for the new Reconstruction governments in the South. And what it did was give Black men the vote. So Black men get the vote in the South in 1867, and they get it by statute, not yet by constitutional amendment. But we now have a new electorate in the South. And that new electorate, and you have an alliance between Black voters and white Republican voters, and they put in new Republican Reconstruction governments. And it's these governments that pass the 14th Amendment. That's how the 14th Amendment gets passed. That's how those states get readmitted to Congress. Now, these Reconstruction governments were also biracial. It wasn't 50-50, but Black folks were in these governments, and they were holding office for the first time. And these Reconstruction governments did things like establish the first public education system in the South, hospitals in the South, effective public health measures in the South. 9 of 10 of these legislatures also extended to married women property rights for the first time. Now, what you don't get is land confiscation. There were a couple of radical Republicans who supported land confiscation. Almost all Republicans, including almost all radical Republicans, rejected land confiscation. Now, what they did do is pass homestead legislation. So there's 1862, there's a Homestead Act where Blacks are eligible. 1866, there's the Southern Homestead Act where Blacks are eligible. But the thing is, according to the National Park Service, many fewer Black families benefited from that 1862 Act. Only 3,500 Black families are said to have benefited from it. 1.5 million white families were said to benefit from it. And with that Southern Act, Black families got much inferior land. And so this played out differently if you were Black or if you were white. And this is also an appropriate time to pivot slightly and to identify an aspect of Reconstruction that sometimes doesn't get included in stories of Reconstruction. And that is that Reconstruction had an east-west axis, in addition to having a north-south axis. We're all familiar with that north-south axis. But that east-west axis had to do with what at the time was called Indian removal. Folks are familiar with Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears in the southern part of the country. Republicans participated in Indian removal and federal land policy and their techniques. They privatized to some extent, Indian removal. They passed railroad acts during the Civil War that gave Union Pacific, that gave Central Pacific authority to remove indigenous populations, and those railroad companies did it violently. The government gave homesteads to Union soldiers on the condition that they would do the fighting, to quiet, as the phrase was, the land. Now, Grant, and you have a file on Grant and federal Indian policy, again, as it was called. And in that file, you'll find some more information about this. Grant was actually what was called an assimilationist when it came to indigenous populations, where he wanted reservations, he wanted indigenous populations to take up farming, he supported Christianization. He did not support this extermination policy that was favored by many of his generals. William Sherman, of famed 40 acres and a mule William Sherman, favored the extermination policy. And even Grant, when indigenous people resisted assimilation, Grant also turned to violent means. The Union, the North acquired the Black Hills and South Dakota violently. And so it's important to keep in mind this mixture of positions among the Republicans who gave us Reconstruction. The same Republicans who suppressed the Ku Klux Klan, and I'm going to turn to this now, also were part of, just like the Democrats, were part of this Indian removal policy for the 19th century. And so the combination of beliefs is one of these overarching themes. I've already gestured to the centrists and even to Lincoln last time. They combine egalitarian views with clearly racial beliefs. The centrist Republicans never fully accept public accommodation rights. Radical Republicans never accept racial intermarriage. And so understanding racism as a continuum is vital for understanding most of these Republicans who give us the Reconstruction reforms, but also understanding racism as existing on more than one axis at the same time. How you feel about former slaves in the South versus how you feel about indigenous populations. All right, the challenge of rights enforcement in the South. There was massive, violent resistance to Reconstruction the entire time. And this is lynching, this is whipping, on top of threats and intimidation. This is directed mainly at Blacks. It is also directed at white Republicans. And this is what drives centrists to broader legislation. This is what drives them to embrace the 15th Amendment, which they do, and to embrace very broad and very powerful anti-Klan legislation. So you have a database on episodes of violence, and the Equal Justice Initiative has done the best job to gather this data, and so you have that database. Now, the Klan was born in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Ex-Confederates formed it, and this was the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party. This is homegrown terror, and the goals were white supremacy and Black subordination on economic, political, social dimensions, all of it. There was also the goal to destroy the Republican Party. Elections were a major target of not just fraud and violence and lynching, but the whole gamut of violence and intimidation tactics. Now, the Southern Democrats had lost control of their legislatures when the Black Codes, when the Reconstruction Act of 1867 was passed. You now have these Reconstruction governments, so they're out of power in the legislature. But these Southern Democrats retain control of local criminal justice systems. They're still the sheriffs, they're still the prosecutors, and they're not punishing Klan violence. They're also in charge of the telegraph offices. And the telegraph offices are how news got sent from south to north. And they're not sending north accounts of Klan violence. And if they send north accounts of violence, they're blaming Black people for it. And so these newspapers, which at the time were associated with political parties, Republican newspapers got some better information about Klan violence because it was transmitted by their own party members. but not great information is getting out up north about Klan violence. Now, in terms of the movement of centrist Republicans to embrace the 15th Amendment, there were both principled reasons for this and pragmatic reasons for this. The principled reasons have to do with, if we go back to Frederick Douglass in 1863, when people were saying, you know, Black people can't have the vote, they're ignorant. When that stereotype was circulating, Douglass responds, again, you have his speech, I will hear nothing about any ignorance of the Black man. If he knows enough to be hanged, he knows enough to vote. And it's clear that white men without property had the vote. And so it's only principled that Black men without property should vote. And Republicans came to believe this. Now, on top of this, they're also seeing after 1867, Black citizenship right before their eyes. They're seeing Black voting in the South. They're seeing Black men holding office in the South and being part of these functioning Reconstruction governments. Now, on the pragmatic side, the Republicans want to build a Southern wing to their party. Blacks vote solidly Republican. And there's also the long-term concern that eventually those soldiers will have to be withdrawn. And the idea is that the 15th Amendment will reduce the need for that. And so we get the 15th Amendment. The right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of race. Now you have Grant's, you have two messages on the part of Grant to Congress about, the first one is on the ratification of the 15th Amendment, and the second one is on this very powerful piece of legislation, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Just briefly, what's notable about the first message on the ratification of the 15th Amendment, Grant rebukes the Dred Scott decision explicitly on citizenship. He calls the 15th Amendment, quote, a measure which makes at once 4 million people voters who were, and he's not including, Black women are seen to be represented by Black men, and this is how it worked for white people also. Women don't get the vote until the 20th century. He calls the 15th Amendment a measure which makes at once 4 million people voters who were previously declared by the highest tribunal not citizens of the United States nor eligible to become so. So he's explicitly rebuking Dred Scott. And he says the adoption of the 15th Amendment completes the greatest civil change and constitutes the most important event that has occurred since this nation came to life. And so this is a very powerful embrace of the 15th Amendment. Massive violence is continuing. And so Congress passes this enforcement legislation that will allow the federal government to prosecute the Klan more effectively. Grant called for this legislation. He called for Congress to establish the Department of Justice, which Congress did in 1870, to manage this. And Grant says repeatedly, where civil authority in the South fails to secure the protection of life and property, we need federal legislation. And he repeated about this failure of local communities. Congress had commissioned a report on the Klan. They get a 13-volume report on the violence of the Ku Klux Klan in the South. And Grant, also under this Klan Act, gets the power of martial law. And he imposes martial law on 9 counties in South Carolina because he wants to make an example of this hotbed of Klan activity. And we get in South Carolina what are called the Ku Klux Klan trials of 1870 and 1871, and Klansmen go to jail. They are prosecuted effectively. And it's not an accident that the 1872 presidential election, Grant gets reelected, turns out to be the most peaceful election of Reconstruction. And that's not a surprise when you think about it. The federal government is prosecuting the Klan. They're making it very clear that they're devoting resources to it. Now, with regard to the debate over the Klan Act in Congress, I want to identify one of the second line of division between the radicals and the centrists. I've already pointed to one line of division between the centrists and the radicals, which is that the radicals were the visionaries in many ways. And the centrists sort of caught up to the more radical vision, although they would only go so far. So the radicals had this broader definition of freedom, initially saying the vote should be included. Well, they also had a line of division on federalism. And what you see from the centrists in the Congress that's debating the Klan Act You have Representative James Garfield. You have this quote in one of the files called the Supreme Court materials. James Garfield is centrist. And remember, the centrists have the balance of power. He says basically the laws in the South are now equal on their face. We got rid of the black codes. He says the problem is not unequal laws on their face. The problem is that facially equal laws are not being enforced, that there are no remedies for when the Klan attacks Black people or white Republicans. And he says, if this federal intervention is made dependent on state denial of rights, on state failure to prosecute the Klan, then he gives it his full support. And this is this corrective power that the states have what's called original jurisdiction, but if they fail to punish, and Garfield says explicitly, this is a denial of the equal protection of the law. It's a violation of the 14th Amendment. If you can show state refusal, the federal government can come in and prosecute those Klansmen. The radicals weren't there, they didn't have this vision of federalism. They argued that the federal government ought to have the power to punish Klansmen regardless of what the states do. You don't even need to give states a chance to enforce the law. And so the radicals would have displaced local law enforcement just right off the bat without waiting to see what states do. This is a difference in federalism, and it's a very important distinction between centrists and radicals. Now, after the passage of the Klan Act and these Klan trials, rights enforcement climbs. It goes up 1870, 1871, 1872, 1873. It's still going up, and you have these numbers. I've given you the numbers on voting rights enforcement in the South in that Supreme Court file. But what happens in 1873 is that there is an economic panic, and there is a very steep economic depression that kicks in for the rest of the decade. And at the time, this was called the Great Depression. And unfortunately, in today's accounts of Reconstruction, today's history, there's oftentimes not enough attention to this economic depression. And the reason this depression is so important is because it fundamentally changes the ground under which the Republicans are working. And it made the depression make civil rights enforcement a political liability for the Republican Party. And when there is an economic depression and one party is in power, this is always the case, voters hold that party accountable. And sure enough, in 1874, the Democrats win control of the House. And what they do is they cut off funding for civil rights enforcement. And funding is so necessary, it's so expensive to prosecute. And so the Democrats cut off funding. The country's still in the midst of the Depression in 1876. And people might be familiar with this contested presidential election. It's happening in the grip of the Depression. Folks thought Republicans were going to lose. And the conventional story about this contested election is that a backroom deal was made between the Republicans and the Democrats. And the deal is called the Compromise of 1877. And according to this story, the Democrats agree to let the Republican become the president, and they give the Republicans control of national economic policy. But in return, the Republicans supposedly just stop rights enforcement and give home rule to the South. And this is known as the Compromise of 1877. And if you go on Wikipedia and if you look on a lot of cases, 1877 is identified as the conventional end of Reconstruction, because Hayes, who is that Republican president, pulled the remaining troops out of the South. And he did do that. That's not contested. But if you actually look at what happens, if you keep the camera rolling, what you see is that by 1879, the Depression lifts. And by this point, the Democrats took the Senate. They took the Senate in 1878. And Hayes, in response to this, says, that reconciliation policy was a mistake. We shouldn't have done it because these Democrats are not to be trusted, that it was a mistake of policy. And in 1880, the Depression's over. James Garfield, that representative I mentioned last time, a centrist Republican, he runs for president on a Reconstruction platform. And you have that platform. And he runs on a voting rights platform. And not only does Garfield win in 1880, the Republicans win back the House and the Senate. And this is what's called the policy window. And what happens is that the Republicans reboot voting rights enforcement. And you can see it in these numbers. In the 1880s, voting rights enforcement comes back. Now, it doesn't approach where it was in 1873 because the ground is shifting and parts of the Republican Party are starting to morph into the party of big business. But the presidential wing of the Republican Party is still committed to voting rights. They are enforcing voting rights in the South in selective locations. And those numbers are important for sort of how I'm going to kind of wind down my talk, because there is a conventional story about the end of Reconstruction. And that conventional story about the end of Reconstruction, this is today's story, is that the Republican Party abandoned Blacks. Hi, Scott. That the Republican Party abandoned Blacks in 1877, and that the Supreme Court cemented this, consolidated this with a legal rule in their case law that actually made it impossible for the federal government to prosecute Klansmen when states fail to punish them. And what I'm actually going to do is refer you to another lecture that I gave back in 2015. And I believe Scott has put that in the chat. Wonderful. And so that's really part two to this presentation, because it's impossible to do all of it in an hour. And so I'm free riding on my 2015 lecture. But I want to flag a couple of things for you, and I can give you here kind of a sense, just a taste of what's going on there. And so, again, the conventional story is that the Republicans said, we're done in 1877, and the Supreme Court made sure that they were done. And what you get in the lecture are sort of are reasons for thinking that story is correct, but what you also get is all of the evidence against that story. Hayes renounced the reconciliation policy in 1878. That Depression lifted. We had the rebooting. And what I do in that talk is go through major Supreme Court decisions that, in fact, did not shut the door on federal power to protect Black physical safety and Black voting. Now, it didn't provide support for public accommodation rights. And again, that combination is a very centrist Republican combination. Principled support for physical security and the vote, but resistance to what centrists called social equality. Radical Republicans wanted to include access to public accommodation rights as a civil right, as necessary for freedom. And in 1875, Congress appeared to embrace this radical position. They passed what was called the Civil Rights Act of 1875 that had a public accommodations provision in it. The Supreme Court strikes this down. And what you have in the excerpts, because like I said, I wanted to give you enough today just to sort of throw up caution flags around this traditional story of Reconstruction's end. And what you have in the excerpt is a statement in the decision where it says, public accommodation rights are social rights. But the court embraces the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which I spent quite a lot of time talking about, and it includes voting rights as protected. And so this point that for centrist Republicans, you can be committed to Black physical security and voting, but not be at all supportive of equal public accommodation laws, is kind of this big takeaway theme. And then, we have voting rights rebooted in the 1880s. If that conventional story were correct, how do you explain the rebooting of voting rights enforcement in the 1880s? And there was a very important court decision in 1884. A unanimous court sent Klansmen to jail under the 15th Amendment. That should have been impossible if that conventional story is correct. So that's just a little taste of that 2015 lecture. Now I want to close just by identifying some reasons for the defeat of Reconstruction. And there were multiple causes. The first major cause was massive, sustained white supremacist violence. Without a doubt, that is the major reason for the defeat of Reconstruction. The economic depression of the 1870s, very important. It took the air out of enforcement. You also had an inadequate administrative apparatus. You needed an administrative apparatus to enforce the law, and that just simply did not exist at the time. The Republican Party morphed. I referenced this earlier. It morphs into the party of big business. This becomes the era of corporate consolidation. You see the rise of social Darwinism. I'll talk about this next time. And in 1888, you get one last gasp. I put 1890 as the end of Reconstruction. There's a growing sort of scholarly movement in that direction to date it to 1890. And that's not only because of the upturn in voting rights enforcement in the 1880s, but in 1888, we have a Republican president again, Republican Congress, one last policy window. They try one more time with an election law. That election law fails by one vote. And it's that actually motivates all of the developments that are going to produce the Jim Crow era. And so I'll leave off with that here, because the next presentation will be about the Jim Crow era. But the defeat of Reconstruction is not linear. It's not linear, and it unwinds. And even as we get into the 1890s, Black folks are still voting in multiple locations. Obviously not everywhere, but it's the 1890s where the Jim Crow system gets locked in. So I will stop there, and hopefully I will see everybody next week.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Brandwein, for that teaser, I should say, for next week's presentation. And I highly recommend attendees please dive into the Supreme Court lecture that Dr. Brandwein gave on the as C-SPAN presented. It's incredible. So please do. The link is in the chat. So check it out when you have time. This specific webinar series continues on January 25th from 4 to 5 p.m. Please note that each webinar will present new content. So we encourage educators to register. So I did put the registration there to share with your friends, of course. So please register for each date to participate in future webinars by visiting the registration page as linked in the chat box. Many of you have already done this, so you're probably all set. We do invite you to register though, so please do. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Brandwein, for your time and your expertise in sharing this. It's just amazing. I'm so enthralled. Please make sure to complete the survey. That will be linked to you when you close out of this Zoom webinar. And again, the sketch form is linked in the chat, so grab that link before you leave, and then have a great rest of your day, everyone.